Is there a better explanation, really, for the severe weather phenomena, including hurricanes, that we've been seeing? Is a better explanation simply nature running amok in the last days? So we're going to dive into this subject tonight. I do have a couple points of housekeeping. First off, just another reminder that the 10 potent proofs for the pre-trib rapture is available on Amazon. It's available in Kindle form. It's available in paperback form. And it's also available for Barnes & Noble and Apple and Kobo and a few of the other main Kindle book and audio, not audio books, but ebook versions they're available. Also tonight, I'll be preaching at 6 p.m. tonight at Faith Baptist in Hampton, Virginia, and again tomorrow morning. And the last item, continue to keep me in prayer for my book writing. It's been really hard when I'm on the road to find enough time to write and keep up on my live stream. Just pray that God will give me wisdom and help, that I can be able to go forwards like a productivity ninja and just get a ton of stuff done. Well, let's move into the subject at hand. Is there proof that the government is creating, modifying, and steering hurricanes? Or is this just a shaky conclusion that people are drawing from insufficient evidence? We really have to know here. If we don't have sufficient evidence, then it's going to be tremendously difficult to make a case for this. Is there a better explanation for the evidence that we see? Is it a better explanation to say what we're seeing is simply nature running amok? Now, the claim that people are making is that the government is manipulating weather in a very, very large degree. They're claiming not merely that we're doing cloud seeding, not merely that we're doing chemtrails, not merely that there's a spraying of aerosols into the ionosphere, but they're claiming that the government is actually creating, modifying, and steering hurricanes. And they sent me, because I first brought this up a couple weeks back and I made a comment on it in one of my videos, and I got a flurry of emails from people sending me links to proof, or at least what they regarded as proof, that the government was engaged in weather modification. Well, folks, I just want to let you know there's no controversy as far as I'm concerned whether or not the government is engaged in weather modification. They've been engaged in weather modification since World War II. That's not the question. We've been cloud seeding for decades. We've been spraying aerosols in the upper atmosphere for decades. We've been engaged in the chemtrail science for decades. So this is not in question. Nobody, I don't know any serious Christian that's questioning that, unless they're just questioning aspects about it and how significant it is. So, but people were sending me a ton of proof to prove that the government is engaged in severe weather modification. And I looked at these proofs. I had dozens of links to look at, dozens of videos, dozens of audio clips, and dozens of links to websites. And so there was links with interviews with well-known scientists. There was links to lists of patents. There was links to the evidence of satellites that were present in recent hurricanes. There was evidence of lasers being pointed at hurricanes. There was evidence of aircraft that belonged to various government agencies that were flying in the vicinity of hurricanes. And the idea was that all this evidence points together that the government is modifying or causing hurricanes. Well, I look at all this evidence that people sent me and the stuff that I'd seen before they sent it to me, and I come to a very different conclusion. My conclusion is this is definitely evidence that the government is engaged in weather modifications on a micro level and is working on gaining the ability to modify weather on a modest level. But there's zero evidence that I've ever seen, and zero evidence for all the dozens of links that were sent to me, zero evidence that the government is currently modifying weather at a modest degree, much less modifying weather at a very massive degree. So the evidence that was sent is extremely weak. So there's tons of evidence, folks, tons of evidence. There's encyclopedias worth of evidence for micro modification. So notice I said micro, M-I-C-R-O, micro modification. We've been doing cloud seeding, chemtrails, and upper atmosphere aerosols for decades. There's really not even a conspiracy here anymore. This is pretty much common knowledge. Now, for instance, with the upper atmosphere aerosols, they're spraying different aluminum compounds, they're spraying barium and strontium and numerous other metals that probably shouldn't be sprayed up there. And the government can be a bit evasive on these programs, not necessarily outright denying that they're doing them. Sometimes they do, but mostly just evasive on what the purpose of these experiments are. But this stuff is common knowledge, and it's typically not denied anymore, except by people who really their Christianity doesn't allow for any kind of conspiracy theory at all. Now, there's also lots of evidence for what I call modest weather modification. There's evidence that they have ambitions to modify weather on a modest level, and there's evidence of experiments on this direction and programs geared to this direction, tons of evidence out there. And what modest weather modification is affecting weather in a local area, like creating or steering a local thunderstorm. So this is not talking about a massive snowstorm front that comes across the Rockies and moves across the plains and then drifts up northeast towards New England, the Great Lakes. That's not what this is talking about. That's a massive weather modification. They're right now working on trying to modify weather on a modest level. They've had limited success with the micro level. It's not been a home run. It's not even been a double, maybe a single with some of them. So we are definitely modifying weather on the micro level with limited success. We're aiming at modifying weather on a modest degree, like a local thunderstorm. So far, there's been no clear, undeniable success with creating or steering local thunderstorms. Now, they do have dreams of doing this. They have ambitions about doing this, and they've made no bones about it. Scientists and military leaders have come right out and said, whoever gets control of this, they are at the cutting edge of dominating the world. Now, there's also a lot of evidence that people would want to be able to modify weather on a massive scale, massive weather modification. So we're talking here earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, massive tornado storms. They would love to be able to handle this. Obviously, they're claiming that they want to be able to do this to steer hurricanes away from populated areas, to steer tornado thunderheads away from populated areas. If they could do that, that would be wonderful. But it's also, you know, if mankind has that kind of power, we can't really trust governments, and they would use that the same way they would use nuclear weapons. They would use it for military weapons. But I've got to say this, folks, out of all the links that were sent to me, out of all the links that I've read myself over the past decades, I've seen zero evidence. Let me say that again. Zero evidence for modest weather modification successfully on a regular basis, and zero evidence for any kind of massive weather modification. Now, they've made efforts for massive weather modification, and we're going to get into that, but no evidence that they've ever had any kind of success in massive weather modification. And I see people making snide remarks now in the feed saying, we disagree, goodbye. You know what? If that's your attitude, goodbye. What I'm looking for in dealing with the people of God is that people can weigh both sides of a controversy. And what I have observed when it comes to controversy is if people get married to one side of the controversy, they are absolutely incapable of weighing the evidence against that position or weigh evidence on the other side. And if people have that kind of a mentality when it comes to dealing with evidence, it absolutely guarantees that they will hold false doctrine. There's no way that you can preserve yourself from embracing false doctrine, and no way that you can extricate yourself from false doctrine if you start to believe it. We really need to have an attitude that we weigh both sides. For instance, let's say you get lucky enough that you're saved into a fellowship that believes in the pre-tribulation rapture and eternal security, so that you're on the right side of the issue, and you're pretty sure that you're on the right side of the issue. But if you don't read both sides of the issue, don't study both sides of the issues, learn the arguments from both sides of the issues, learn how they use evidence on both sides of the issues, your foundation in the truth is going to be weak. And let's say that you get saved into a church, or you've been weak in your foundation and you get converted into a church that teaches an anti-pre-trib rapture position, whether pre-wrath or post-trib. If you're married to the argument for a post-trib or a pre-wrath rapture, and you're scoffing at the pre-trib rapture, there's no way that you can weigh the evidence to actually learn the truth. So we really need to be evidence weighers, folks. We need to weigh both sides. You know what? Another thing I've noticed about this, I was going to say this later on, but I'll just say it now. One thing I've noticed in the last few years is in some circles, in believing circles, in pre-trib circles, in some of these circles, gullibility is the proof positive that you have discernment. And I can hardly understand how this works. Why would gullibility and refusal to weigh all the evidence be proof that you're spiritual? Why would that be evidence that you have discernment? Discernment takes all the evidence and weighs it carefully. Well, anyway, let's move on with this. I said that I've seen zero evidence that we are actually engaged in massive weather modification. In fact, zero evidence that we're engaged in successfully, modestly. And we can't even steer a thunderstorm, folks. How in the world are we going to steer a massive tornado thunderfront or a hurricane? Now, what's interesting is some of the evidence that people sent me. They would be pointing out, see, this guy says we can. This scientist says we can modify hurricanes. And they jumped on a little line and believed what they wanted to believe. If they had actually carefully read the entire paper that they sent me, they would have figured out that the person was not saying we can presently modify or direct hurricanes. What they were saying is, we think that we're able to develop the technology. We have the theory that we think will work, but we have to develop the technology that we can cause or steer hurricanes. Now, this is a very different thing. It's very different to say we can right now cause a hurricane, or to say we as human beings have the technological capacity or capability to create a hurricane. Very different things. There might be 2 or 3 centuries between those two things. So really, when these guys are saying that we can modify hurricanes, we can direct hurricanes, they're not saying that we can do it right now. They are saying that if we focus enough attention, enough time, enough funds, enough brain power on the subject, then we will come up with the technology to modify massive storms like hurricanes. And given enough time, maybe they'd need a century, maybe another 2 centuries, they would eventually get there. We're not there right now. In fact, a lot of people don't understand this. To create and maintain a Category 5 hurricane, you require 200 times the entire energy of the that's used in the entire world, that's created in the entire world, like all the electrical energy, whether it's from nuclear or hydroelectric, you'd need all that electricity in the entire world, 200 times the amount that's created in a day. You'd need that much to create and sustain a Category 5 hurricane. And that doesn't even take up the question of how in the world you're going to direct that much energy. Folks, you can't take a little HARP facility, whether it's in Canada or in Antarctica or wherever else it is, and aim that thing at the sky and turn it on and create a hurricane. It doesn't work that way. That technology is designed for measuring the response in the heavens to different phenomena. They're just on the experimental stage right now. And how are you going to direct 200 times? Let's say you had a secret facility that was capable of generating 200 times the amount of electricity that's generated in the entire world. And then now you still have to direct that energy to your focusing sources. So somehow you've got to put this much energy through the air to your satellites or to your space station, whatever you're using. How in the world are you going to run that much energy through the air and not have it show up? That you're not going to be able to read it with measuring phenomena. Probably would even end up being visible to the naked eye. Now you have to take all that energy and focus it on dozens of satellites that are going to be, whatever they're projecting, they got to project it at the right angle in the right direction to create a hurricane eye. And then that's a whole nother system of energy. If you're going to try and steer that thing and not let nature steer it, now beyond the capacity of energy that you need to create and maintain this, now you need a nearly equal amount of energy to steer this beast, and you maybe will need even more energy to steer this beast, because nature has a massive amount of energy in it. So anyway, let me just mention some of the links that were sent to me. Michio Kaku, a lot of people sent me the link from Michio Kaku, the Japanese scientist who's really a savvy and intelligent man when it comes to physics. And he had an interview some years back with the CBS TV program This Morning. And people sent to me, see, we're controlling and making hurricanes. And I watched this video clip several times. It's like absolutely nothing was said that would give any reasonable proof that we're actually making hurricanes right now or steering them. All that was said was that the government, that there's plans in the scientific world and government agencies for, right now they're focused on modifying local weather, specifically talked about local thunderstorms. So that to be able to create and modify or direct a local thunderstorm that's 15, 20 miles across, folks, this is like 1/100th of what we're talking about with a hurricane or a massive tornado front. Very, very different creatures. And he did not say that we are capable right now of modifying and steering and directing local thunderstorms. That's merely the goal that they're working at. we're probably decades away from doing that right now. Now, a lot of people sent me stuff on Project Popeye, the well-known cloud seeding program in Vietnam. It was a program that was largely regarded as a failure. It wasn't a complete failure. They had some limited successes, but it didn't work consistently. No matter what they dropped in the clouds, no matter how they dropped it, when they dropped it, where they dropped it, sometimes it worked great, sometimes it worked modestly, sometimes it didn't work at all. Nature has a mind of its own. You know, people sent me links on Project Storm Fury, which was a weather modification program that I wound up in the 80s somewhere. And it was largely a failure. They had a few instances where seeded hurricanes changed direction or were modified, but there wasn't conclusive evidence that their efforts were what caused it, because hurricanes in and of themselves increase and decrease in strength rapidly. For instance, the recent Hurricane Milton, less than 24 hours before landfall, it was measuring at a high Cat 4, low Cat 5 hurricane. There was people forecasting it could hit shore as a massive record-breaking Category 5. And there was reason to fear that that would be the case. And yet when it reached shore, it was a Category 3, which we're very, very thankful for. Now, but so hurricanes rapidly accelerate in strength, they rapidly decrease in strength, and this doesn't necessarily constitute any kind of proof of human involvement. And they can rapidly change directions too. It's just one weather condition banging up against another weather condition. I see comments about the prayers against the hurricanes, and I would not be a bit surprised if God responded to the prayers of the believers in this regard. Now, another one that people sent me a lot of links on was Project Cirrus in 1947, which, if I understand this correctly, it was part of a much broader project. It was probably an aspect of a bigger hurricane research program. But in 1947, they dropped 180 pounds of dry ice in the eye wall of a hurricane. And this hurricane very shortly veered west and smashed into Georgia. And a lot of people blame the government for this hurricane veering west and smashing into Georgia. But there's a couple of problems with blaming the government for this hurricane turning into the shore. First of all, there's I won't even say virtually, there is zero chance, folks, zero chance that 180 pounds of dry ice is going to significantly impact a hurricane in any way, shape, or form. You know, when the ice was dropped, they were looking to measure if they could measure any distinct differences or changes. That's what was going on. They weren't actually attempting to fully steer this thing or kill it. They were just looking to see if there was going to be any energy drop at all. So, but 180 pounds of dry ice, folks, that's like you walking down the sidewalk and not even noticing that you stepped on an ant. An ant isn't going to slow you down one bit. There's no way that 180 pounds of dry ice is going to slow or stop a hurricane, much less turn it. This makes no sense to even consider that that's a possibility. Now, where this hurricane turned, folks, you have to understand this. When hurricanes first form, they are forming near the equator or somewhere close to the equator, and they're moving across the Atlantic. And as they get close to the shore, the weather fronts coming off the shore start pushing them, so they're paralleling shore. There has to be a lot of force in that hurricane for it to make landfall and then stay on land. It's typically the weather patterns from the continent are going to push it back out to sea, either before it makes landfall or shortly after landfall. Occasionally, they'll actually cross Florida and then go into the Gulf. But when hurricanes get close to the 30th parallel, if the westerlies are blowing strong, then they will blow that hurricane back out towards sea. And that's a pretty common hurricane pattern. But if the westerly winds are weak, then that hurricane doesn't have anything to push it out. There's not another massive front pushing against it, and it just maintains its momentum and makes landfall. When hurricanes hit the Atlantic seaboard, like in Georgia or the Carolinas, that's what is happening. The westerlies are too weak, and that hurricane just gets pushed by the other forces that are pushing that hurricane in a generally westward direction. So again, folks, when this hurricane in 1947 smashed into Georgia, all it was doing what hurricanes do when the westerlies are blowing weak. And there's no way that 180 pounds of dry ice caused that hurricane to turn. So to look at that experiment and claim that man is manipulating hurricanes is really, this is problematic. This is drawing massive conclusions from minimal data, and we don't want to do that. Another one that people sent me links to was Project Snowy, where the government has spent a lot of time through agencies and through cooperations with universities studying how to make snow clouds in the West drop more snow. Well, the difficulty here with this is a snow cloud can't drop any more snow than is in it. And so if you get it to drop on point A, now it's not going to drop on point B. So there's really no overall gain unless you're specifically trying to get the water to fall in one watershed. Then maybe there would be a gain there. But it's relatively easy to seed snow clouds and get them to drop their snow a little earlier than they would have. But this is a micro weather modification, folks. This isn't modest weather modification. Modest weather modification would be creating thunderstorms or snowstorms. We're nowhere the ability to do that. Right now, we can, with inconsistent abilities, cause electrical discharge from clouds and create lightning. We can't consistently do it. No one's ever consistently done that. And we can relatively consistently induce rainfall and snowfall. But to induce it the degrees that we would like to, we so far have not succeeded. And to induce it consistently where we want it to fall, we're not really getting that job done either. Now, another one that a lot of people sent me was a film clip of Lyndon B. Johnson. And in one of the ones that someone sent me, it wasn't Lyndon B. Johnson speaking, but I suspect that a lot of people thought that it was Lyndon B. Johnson speaking. And it was the narrator of the video claiming that the U.S. government possesses the power to create and control hurricanes and has had this power for decades. You know, the ability to create and control massive storm fronts and hurricanes, and we've been doing it for decades. But that was not Lyndon B. Johnson speaking. In the original clip, Lyndon B. Johnson only spoke about the ambition and to change weather and the ability, if we pursue it and investigate it and prosecute it and develop the technology, we will be able to manipulate weather. That's all that was being said. No claims that we could consistently do it in his day. Now, pointing to this kind of information is proof that the U.S. government is currently modifying or creating hurricanes is a sloppy handling of the facts. In fact, folks, let me just say this. I know it sounds harsh, but it needs to be heard and it needs to be considered. If you can look at the kind of evidence that that I was just mentioning that people are pointing to as evidence that we're manipulating and controlling and making hurricanes. If you can draw that conclusion from that evidence, I'll just say it, you are gullible. You're not thinking clearly. You're not thinking soberly. You're gullible. Now, pointing to this evidence for micro modification and pointing to programs exploring the ability for modest modification, and then take that evidence and claim that we are currently engaged in massive modification, like making and steering hurricanes. Folks, this is like pointing to a 3-year-old kid on a microbike with training wheels and point to his claims that he chatters away happily saying, when I grow up, I want to ride a motorcycle, and then looking at those two pieces of evidence and claiming that that kid right now currently races on the international motorcycle racing circuit on a big Ducati motorcycle. You can't look at that kind of evidence and make those kind of conclusions without indicating either you turned your thinker off or you're just extremely gullible. It doesn't fit, folks. Anyway, so we just looked at the fact, I've got 3 main arguments, and we just looked at the first one. The first one is that the evidence is extremely weak. So let me close this point out by saying this. I'll just offer a challenge. If you have real proof, folks, real proof that the government is currently making and modifying hurricanes, please send it my way. But if you send me the same kind of silly, shallow stuff that people have been sending me, the same video clips, and the same YouTube channels with 3 hours worth of video that boil down to about 15 seconds worth of nonsense, if you keep sending me that stuff, I'll just throw it away. Send me real proof, and I will investigate it. I will weigh it. But right now, I am extremely skeptical that the U.S. government is modifying on a modest level, much less a massive level. So if you have the proof, send it to me. But don't get mad at me, folks, if you send me this Michio Kaku video for the 50th time and I'm not convinced. Now, my second problem that I have with this massive weather modification theory is this. It's inconsistency. Think about this, folks. Everybody that I know that I've seen their videos or listened to their stuff on weather modification, they're saying man is creating hurricanes. Now, folks, every one of these people also rejects man-caused climate change. Can you see the inconsistency here? Think about it. There's a contradiction here. With the forked tongue, with one side of the forked tongue, they say, I absolutely reject man-caused weather problems. And then out the other side of their mouth, with the other side of their forked tongue, they say, I absolutely believe in man-caused weather problems. Now, how can you absolutely reject man-caused weather problems and at the same time absolutely believe in and insist on man-caused weather problems? This makes no sense. This is absolutely, completely, entirely inconsistent. But this is what these folks are doing. They're saying with one moment they say they reject man-caused weather change, and the next breath they say they believe in man-caused weather change. But folks, error is always inconsistent. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is if you start reading from Job 38 and going forwards, you'll have a whole bunch of conversation that God has with Job. Let me just read a few portions here. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? And then he goes on and he brings up stuff like, have you entered the springs of the sea, verse 16? Or have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? You drop down to verse 19. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where does it live? You come down to verse 22. Have you entered into the treasury of the snow? Or have you seen the treasury of hail? How about verse 24? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where no one lives, and on a wilderness where there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste? So as you continue through this section, folks, he talks about all the different aspects of weather that he alone, that God alone controls. And he alone is the one who creates storms, who creates rainstorms, who creates snowstorms, who creates hailstorms. This is his province alone. The angels cannot manipulate the weather. Only God can manipulate the weather. And even in the book of Job, when Satan got permission from God to sift Job, I want you to notice that God said to Satan, you have moved me to lift my hand against him. Satan couldn't do bring the things upon Job except by moral influence. He persuaded God, let's go ahead and try Job. I think he'll fail. And God says, okay, I'll try Job, but I don't think he's going to fail. But only God could bring upon Job the things that came upon him. The devil has no ability to immediately bring those things upon him. Even, for instance, when we look at the maximum ability that the satanic realm has, the biggest miracle in the Bible that we see Satan working is calling down fire from heaven in the tribulation. Now, that's no small feat. I mean, a man cannot do that. But calling down fire from heaven does not even get into the same category as the Lord Jesus calming the storm or the Lord Jesus calling for a storm. Satan can call down fire from heaven, and he can do a few of the lower degree miracles that the priests, for instance, in Egypt worked in contrast to Moses. But once they got to a certain level, Satan couldn't go beyond it. Satan cannot create thunderstorms or hailstorms. Satan cannot create a hurricane or a typhoon or a cyclone or a tornado storm. And if Satan can't do those things, folks, if you understand how the satanic world works and how the relationship of spiritual warfare with man getting tugged between the devil and God, you understand how all this works. You understand that if Satan doesn't have a technology that he can exploit, then he can't pass that technology on to man. All the technology that man has, we ultimately, all this advanced technology, we learned a lot of this from the fallen realm. Some of it we would eventually learn on our own, simply because God has made man to be an investigative creature and to discover and exploit cool things in God's creation. But so often when we learn technology, we get it before we're ready for it, and we get it from the dark side, and we learn how to use it for nefarious purposes. But Satan is unable to manipulate the weather, folks. He can't create a tornado or a hurricane. And if he can't do it, man can't do it, because he would be the source that we get this technology from. Ultimately, when man's attempting to manipulate the weather, he's going down the path of corrupting the earth. He's corrupting nature. He should simply be trusting God. And this is really going to go down the same path as that of the Nephilim, where the Nephilim project was to manipulate and tamper with and defile human DNA. And that was a very evil plan, and God shut that down. God is going to shut down man's weather plans before he ever gets anywhere near fully developing them. Now, let's move on to a different section here. I'm going to quickly check to see what we got going for comments here. Yep, got some great comments going. Thank you, folks, for sharing and indulging in that. So let's move back to my notes here. Some of the counterpoints that are made, people say things like, but hurricanes, I read one guy and very clearly said, hurricanes don't form in the western portions of the Gulf of Mexico and make a beeline for Central Florida. In other words, what he was saying is hurricanes by nature don't do this. Therefore, the implication is this has to be man-caused. Well, there's a couple problems here, folks. The first problem is, where in the world did man get the energy to move that hurricane and steer it? Tell me. Is there a secret base somewhere where we have a secret energy producer that produces more energy than the 100 biggest nuclear reactors in the world? Do you know where this is? Where is this energy source? And then how are they steering this? How are they directing this energy to steer this hurricane? You know, a hurricane is thousands of nuclear bombs worth of power. Where are you coming up with the energy to move this thing? The amount of energy that's behind the ocean currents and the jet streams and the weather patterns that are moving that hurricane, the amount of energy involved there is insane. You're not going to be able to get 20 satellites aiming laser beams at this thing and turn that thing. They've already tried laser beam technology and it didn't work. It's not enough energy for a long enough time to make a hill of beans worth of difference. Now, here's another thing. When people make claims like hurricanes don't start in the western Gulf of Mexico and make a beeline for Central Florida, when they make claims like that, folks, what are we supposed to think? I mean, the only thing I can conclude is either these people didn't do their homework or they don't care about facts. They've got their theory, and the truth, with quotation marks, the truth is more important than truth. It's more important than facts. Let the facts die. Let the facts rot. Throw the facts in the garbage can. We want the truth. Let me show you a couple slides. I think these are going to blow your mind. Here's some past tropical storms. And these vary from things that were a little less than a hurricane up to stuff that was into hurricane strength. Here, they formed in the western Gulf of Mexico. And where did they go? We got two that went right to central Mexico. We got a couple three of them that went up into the section of Florida where the panhandle and the main body touch. So we see tropical storms forming in the western Gulf and making more or less a beeline for Central Florida or for North Central Florida. This is how do people claim that hurricanes don't do this and then they do this? Here's another slide. Here, people say that's just not the normal pattern of hurricanes. Well, here is the hurricanes from the last 170 years in Florida area. Do you see any consistent pattern here? They can start in the Gulf of Mexico and hit southern Florida. They can hit central Florida. They can hit the Panhandle region of Florida. They can go up into Texas and Louisiana. Some of them even started in the Gulf and went south of Florida, went into the Caribbean. And then we've got stuff that starts in the west and goes south of Florida, hits southern Florida, hits central Florida, hits northern Florida. Some of them actually don't hit landfall till they get up into Georgia and the Carolinas. So these things are all over the map, folks. They are all over the map. There is no such thing as a typical hurricane path. Now, there's several generalities. Hurricanes typically start in the east, southeast of Florida and move towards Florida in the Caribbean. And then when they get farther north, they start curving out. This is just a generality. They can follow 200 different paths there. Here's one more slide. Here is historical hurricane tracks in Florida. And you see that there's, again, they're all over the map. It's just a spider web practically of different hurricane paths. And many of them hit Florida. Many of them hit southern, central, northern Florida. Some of them miss Florida, but they're all over the map. So when we look at this kind of information, we want to make sure that we do our homework before we come to conclusions and make statements like hurricanes don't form in the western portion of the Gulf of Mexico and make a beeline for central Florida. That simply is not historically true. And folks, if we profess to believe the historical grammatical hermeneutic and we come up with our interpretation of prophetic things, those prophetic things have to agree with the facts of history, and they have to agree with the facts of grammar. And a few other points are important too, but you have to have those ingredients. Now, another counterpoint that people have made is that, but you can't trust the government. Well, I agree. We can't trust the government. But how is the fact that we can't trust the government proof that the government creates, modifies, and steers hurricanes? There's no necessary connection between the two. Men haven't trusted the government since the 1700s, and they weren't creating storms back then. We don't trust them today. There's no proof, no connection that they create hurricanes. Well, here's another one that people have counterpointed with. But the government is exploiting the hurricane situations. Well, perhaps they are. Maybe they're intentionally exploiting it, but maybe that a lot of what you see can be explained simply by bungling incompetence. We don't have to go to an intentional exploitation ground, at least not in some of the circumstances I've been looking at. We definitely see bungling incompetence virtually everywhere we look. But there's nothing in the post-hurricane aftermath fiasco that points to either the government causing the hurricane or steering it. There's no connection. Let the government be as bungling and incompetent as they can be. Let them actually be intentionally exploiting the hurricane. None of this is proof that they caused it or created it. There's zero necessary connection. And to bring this up as part of your evidence package really implies that you sense the weakness of your evidence and you need something to strengthen the evidence. Now, another one that people have said is, but maybe both can be true. Maybe hurricanes can both be nature run amok and man caused. Well, this isn't really an argument, folks. Theoretically, yes, they can both be true. And if we are down here long enough and the Lord tarries long enough, it will go from theory to fact. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Might be decades or centuries away yet, but it's really just a matter of time. But here's my response. Are we in the Starship Enterprise era right now? Yes or no? If we are in the Starship era Enterprise and we can see the Starship Enterprise, then it's reasonable to assume that we are creating hurricanes and steering them and moving them. But if we don't see the Starship Enterprises doing interstellar travel, then it's probably a safe bet that we're not currently making hurricanes. They both involve the massive gathering and exploitation of a massive amount of energy. We have to create and exploit a massive amount of energy. These two things are very similar in the technology that's required. If we have Starship Enterprises, then it's reasonable to believe that we have hurricane manipulation capabilities. If we don't have Starship Enterprises, then it's really unreasonable to believe that we do have technology that's similarly savvy and advanced to manipulate hurricanes. There are similar levels of complexity, folks. Now, when it comes to saying both are true, in theory, both could be true. But in theory, both could be true is not the same thing as, in fact, both are true right now. We have to make a distinction. And we have no business saying both are true unless we have absolutely conclusive proof that the government is actually causing, manipulating, or directing hurricanes. So let me just visit how we interpret data before we bring this to a close. When it comes to interpreting data, we need to follow Occam's razor. It's also called the elegant solution. This simply boils down to this, that the simplest solution that answers all the data is the correct solution. So when we look at all this data that people sent me, data which talked about dreams of exploiting weather and controlling weather, and experiments about that largely failed and some had moderate success, and we look at all this evidence, we need to come up with a solution that answers all that evidence. And claiming from all that evidence that was sent me that man's currently manipulating hurricanes, the evidence does not add up. And again, if you folks have evidence that you didn't send me, please send it. But don't send me something like a list of 100 patents and see, we're manipulating hurricanes, when you read through that list of the 100 patents, and it's all on cloud seeding, aerosol and spraying in the upper atmosphere, and chemtrails. Those technologies are 1,000 times less complex than creating and steering a hurricane. Nobody denies that we're doing those things. The real question is, can we do the hurricane? Right now, there is zero proof that I've ever seen, period, that we're actually manipulating hurricanes. Now, there's a corollary to Occam's razor. Occam's razor says you take the simplest solution that explains all the data. A corollary is don't embrace a conspiracy theory view when mere incompetence of human beings answers the data. In other words, like with this Florida stuff, you see problems with the response, the federal government's response to the hurricane. We're not obligated to go to conspiracy theory ground. Maybe there's some evidence of it, but unless you're obligated by the evidence to go there, you don't need to go anywhere except mere government bungling incompetence, which has been around for 200 years. And we're not making any different complaints now than people made 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago. This is an age-old complaint. The same complaints were in the Roman Empire, the same complaints were in the Greek Empire, and that had nothing to do with weather manipulation. Here's another corollary, folks. Don't embrace a conspiracy theory explanation when nature alone answers the data. Remember, in the last days, nature's going to go haywire. Nature's going to run amok. God is going to just like he's going to release his restraining hold on the mystery of iniquity and let the mystery of iniquity go running wild, so he's going to release a lot of his constraint on nature and let nature go running amok. So we don't have any obligation to blame this bad weather on man's hand. Not only do we not have an obligation, I don't even see any evidence we ought to, but certainly we have evidence that in the last days, God is going to let nature run wild. We don't have to pin that blame on man. And there is a danger here, folks. One thing I see with some of these conspiracy theories that are going around in the last few years, they are giving man far more credit than man is due. It's a backhanded way to glorify man. And I really feel some righteous indignation about this. Why would we want to glorify man and give man credit for what only God can do? We have no time of day for that when man puts that in the realm of salvation. Why would we have the time of day for it when they put it in the realm of science? So when it comes to weighing this data, I want you to think about this. If you take a big pile of data and then you intentionally close your eyes to 3/4 or 80% or 90% of that data, and you just selectively pick out a few snippets that prove your theory, this is like playing darts blindfolded. And you're just randomly throwing the dart, and wherever it lands, you say that's where it's supposed to land. But how can you hit the target when you're playing blindfolded? And it's the same thing. When we come to examine the evidence for this or any other controversial issue, we want to examine all the evidence and come up with a solution that can give a hearty amen to every category of evidence. If we can't give a hearty amen to every category of evidence and all the evidence, then we don't have the right solution. If we have to poo-poo half of the evidence, or we have to twist some of the evidence, and we have to ignore most of the evidence, then we can't possibly be right. So again, I just want to point out, it looks to me when I look at issues like this, that people are confusing gullibility and discernment. Folks, if you are not weighing all the evidence, trembling at your handling of the evidence, fearful that you are going to stand before the living God and give account for your handling of the evidence, if you don't have that, then you're gullible. And we need to walk away from this whole mentality of being gullible. We need to weigh all the evidence. Now, I'm not going to be a bit surprised if we discover, because it works this way everywhere, that just like with our modern weapons technology, that what they're developing in DARPA is a couple decades beyond what we're giving the soldiers right now in the battlefield. And so that they're working on technology that's far beyond what we have right now. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the government is working on technology for moderate manipulation of the weather, because right now the technology they're using is only micro manipulation of the weather. I wouldn't be surprised if they're working on stuff that's going to be revealed in the near future for moderate. But it's going to be another big jump from moderate to massive. And it's going to require massive amounts of energy. So for us to go from modest weather manipulation to massive manipulation of the weather, we are not only going to have to come up with the science that can do that, we'll have to come up with the energy production that can do that, and the technology for exploiting that amount of energy. Merely having that amount of energy won't do anything. You merely release that amount of energy and it won't create a hurricane. You have to direct that amount of energy the right way, or you'll have zero hope of creating a hurricane. So, folks, let's get more concerned about weighing all the evidence, being cautious in our conclusions that we reach. There's probably more out there than we know about, but it's a massive, massive jump from what we're seeing right now to massive weather modification. At any rate, I trust that I've given you some food for thought. I trust I've given you some encouragement on how to handle data. We definitely need to be more consistent on how we handle information on this subject and a dozen others like it. With that, this really ends my presentation. We do have time here for 45 minutes or so of Q&A if anyone is interested. So, yeah, someone says here, SCERN is really scary stuff. It definitely is. That technology they're playing with could easily backfire and be a major, major pain for mankind. And not only that, but I'm less afraid of the actual science of CERN than I am concerned about the engagement of some of the leadership with the demonic realm. I'm 10 times more worried about the demonic aspects of this than I am about the actual science. So I don't believe there's any chance at all that we're actually going to cause some massive chain reaction that can suck the whole world into a black hole. I think the odds of that's pretty much zero, but I do believe the odds are extremely high for CERN to be used with satanic manipulation of a kind that's pretty crazy. All right, let me see if we have any Q&A questions coming up, and here we do have some Q&A questions. All right, good question. Says, what is your definition of real proof? Well, real proof has to be proof that's not focused on proving cloud seeding or chemtrails or upper atmosphere aerosols. That we've had proof of that for a long, long time. So modest weather manipulation is where they're working on right now. Micro weather manipulation we've had for a long time. So for real proof, we would have to have evidence of technology that can generate the kind of energy that we need to manipulate a hurricane, to actually have enough energy at our fingertips for a hurricane, to make a hurricane or to steer one. And then we would need evidence of technology that can actually direct that energy to steer a hurricane. You know, it's not enough merely to point a big laser gun at the clouds. That in and of itself is not going to create a hurricane. Who knows what it would cause, but you need wind shear. You need winds coming from different angles to create a hurricane. You need currents coming at different angles to create a hurricane. You need specific patterns of weather to create a hurricane. So we would have to have proof that we can make those different shears, current shears and wind shears and energy congregation come together. That's what we need. And so far, the proof that have been sent to me is about 1 out of 1,000. I mean, in other words, it's just 1/1000th of what we would need to have proof. I've heard some say the 24 elders can't be the church because they appear in heaven before Jesus is seen in heaven. How do you respond to this? Well, I think that's not really a good argument. Jesus ascended to heaven shortly after he died on the cross, 40 days after, really. 40 days after the Feast of First Fruits, so 40 days after his resurrection. So he's in heaven. And I think the only reason that he appears in chapter 4 and 5 after we see the appearance of the saints in chapters 4 and 5 is we are in a formal meeting and we're sitting there waiting for the formalities to take place, and then they introduce the formalities. So I think that's all that's going on there. What are your thoughts on Heiser's divine council posture? Well, there is some value in his remarks on that subject. The angels play you'll see hints all over the Old Testament and a few in the New Testament where the angels are actually much more involved in God's government over creation, both the holy angels and the fallen angels. They're greatly influenced in are part of his government. Some things that I read on his divine counsel make me a little nervous, because it sounds like he is saying that God was actually picking their brains when it comes to how he was going to operate with man. Now, maybe he didn't mean it to sound like that, but that's how I took it. And I can't go there. It almost sounded like the angels had more of a hand in government than I would have given them. Could the hurricanes be judgment for the Biden regime's handling the Middle East? Now, this is a very provocative question. We come to here, now we're on ground where, yeah, we'd have to consider this. I mean, we've seen a lot of evidence in the past where when the U.S. government takes positions or makes a stand that's contrary to Israel's interests, and really it's contrary to God's interests with Israel, that there's been some pretty astounding judgments that have befallen America. I think we need to take that into consideration. We certainly don't want to go down that path. Well, here's a question. Lucifer in the Bible stimulated a terrible storm against Christ while he slept in a boat. Is it possible that Lucifer has taught this human servants to do also to modify weather? Just a thought. Well, when we come into the questions like this, if we see, or we think we see Satan's hand in something like the weather in the scriptures, what we have to understand, we have to go back to the deeper hints that we see in scripture. God says in the book of Job, you moved my hand against Job. So the judgments that were leveled against Job were trials that Satan had to get authorized, and he asked for certain things, and God allowed him to have those certain things. But Satan does not intrinsically have the ability. No created being has the ability to control weather, the level that we see weather being controlled, for instance, in the book of Job. Only God has this ability. So when Christ was down here as a human being, Satan still can't do anything against Christ the man or Christ's disciples unless he seeks permission from the Father in heaven. He always has to have permission, and it's really then what comes is coming from God's hand. Now, this is problematic for people that have been influenced by dualistic thinking, because dualistic thinking has this powerful being Satan who's got all kinds of power over nature, and God has a bunch of power. He just has more power, and these two clash. But this is a dualistic thinking. Satan's power is actually very limited, and he has to continually go to God for permission. He can't put a thorn in Paul's side unless God gives him permission to do that and opens up the door for that to happen. On his own, he can't just say, be a thorn in Paul's side. Did you believe in replacement theology when you were post-trib, and how did you interpret Romans 11 and all the Old Testament promises to Israel back then? You know, I don't think I would be a full-fledged replacement theology person when I was post-trib, because I did believe that God was going to return and restore Israel. But I was on a similar ground that the pre-wrath rapture people are, where you have Israel going on and the church going on at the same time, and they're kind of a sloppy mix. And I think that's where a lot of Christians go. They're not really denying Israel, but they're getting sloppy, and they're mixing Israel and the church at the same time. So they'll have both going on at the same time in the tribulation. Does changing seasons and times have anything to do with government interference? I think this is more passing laws, changing our holidays, changing our calendar, so that instead of marking, I think they're eventually going to quit marking time from Christ and start marking time from the rise of the Antichrist and the New World Order. They're saying, let's start over. This is now year one of the age of Aquarius, or whatever they're going to call it. Okay, we got some more questions here. Oh, this is an interesting question. Is there a possible link between wind blowing the four corners of the house Job's children were partying in, and angels holding back the wind from the four corners of the earth? I would think there is a link, not necessarily a direct link, but simply the fact that the angels, the holy angels, are involved of God. He gives people authority in certain areas of nature, and again, they don't have any intrinsic power to do these things on their own, but he gives them like temporary job assignment power, and whether they guard the corners or they release the corners, they're definitely involved in the weather. Would you agree that it was man trying to manipulate the weather? Well, man has tried to manipulate the weather over and over again, and that's what all these experiments that we've had from the 1940s and World War II era all the way to the present, that's what they're doing. They are trying to manipulate the weather. And they have tried to manipulate hurricanes and failed miserably every time. They've never succeeded. The amount of energy that would needed to be directed at a hurricane to move it, or the amount of matter that would have to be dumped on a hurricane to stall it, is just mind-boggling. I think, on paper, we can come up with, you could drop enough dry ice or something on a hurricane that would change the temperature very rapidly, maybe, frozen nitrogen, for instance. You'd drop a bunch of that in a hurricane, but it would be thousands of plane loads that would have to be dropped. It's just logistical nightmare. So yeah, I can agree they're trying to manipulate the weather, and we know that they manipulate the weather in a micro degree. I mean, we can't deny that. They seed clouds and bring rain. They seed clouds and bring some snow. So that's undeniable. They, do the chemtrails, and they prevent what they think is harmful radiation rays from reaching the earth. They spray aerosols for various purposes in the upper atmosphere, including to restrict, working with the carbon dioxide problem. But macro or major or massive weather modification, all our efforts to try have failed. Why would Lee say the angels cannot manipulate the weather? This is what I would say here. Angels can only manipulate the weather if they have been given permission and power from God to manipulate the weather. That's what we see in Scripture. The angels in and of themselves don't have authority over the weather. God claims that authority for himself. Now, he can give his servants the ability to do anything. So, for instance, when Moses parted the sea, Moses didn't himself part the sea. He was just an instrument of faith at that point in time. When Elijah calls down fire from heaven, he doesn't intrinsically have that power. This was power given to him by God for the moment, exercised in faith. And the same thing when the two witnesses work on judgments and plagues in the last days. These guys don't have that power on their own. They have power given to them for a specific job at a specific time, and that's it. And it's the same with the angels. So if God has given the angels the ability to restrain the weather, like the four angels in Revelation 7, they restrain the four winds of the earth. God gave them that authority and that ability. He loves to use second causes. He loves to use second agents, and he did that. And he's done it in the past, and he still does it, and he will do it again. But that's a very different question from saying that angels have intrinsically have the ability to modify the weather, and that they can pass that ability on to man. What will be the ultimate effect of the angels holding all the wind in Revelation? That is going to be a very interesting day. It's going to create all kinds of atmospheric problems. It's going to create problems here on Earth. It's going to allow pollution to build up in areas where there is pollution. It won't spread it out and drop it in 1,000 places. It's all going to build up in one place. There'll be areas where the oxygen is going to decrease in a hurry, and it'll be problematic. Do you think man can trigger earthquakes? Well, I know man would love to trigger earthquakes. We've worked on some technologies that show promise for triggering earthquakes, but here is the difficulty. The amount of energy needed to cause an earthquake right now is vastly beyond man's ability. I think if God tarried, we would eventually have the technology and the wherewithal to do it. But I don't believe that we cause earthquakes right now. Now, some people say that we're causing earthquakes, like they'll point to lots of tremors in the fracking areas. I suspect, this is my theory, go ahead and check it out if you please, but I suspect that there is a lot of overlap between the areas where we frack for oil and areas where there are potential for modest earthquakes on a regular basis and severe earthquakes in the long term. So that's what I would consider. How probable is the rapture for 2024? I think it's up there. I don't know that I could estimate for sure. I do know the stage is rapidly being set for the tribulation. I do know that I think that we've entered an era where we could literally say the rapture can happen any day, but this is just viewing it from our perspective. We see a very advanced stage setting. We see Gog and Magog coming together, but here's some difficulties that we have. We don't know whether we're going to go up 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years prior to Gog and Magog. Now, I suspect it will be closer rather than farther away. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's 2 months or 2 weeks before Gog and Magog, but it could be 2 years before. So when you start putting variables in like that, it's really hard, even when we see the stage setting, to calculate the probabilities for the rapture this year or next year, because we don't really have enough information in the equation. Well, what kind of things are we missing that we should be paying attention to when we're giving our time to, like, this weather modification conspiracy? Well, for instance, I think that there's a lot of deep state conspiracies. I think people could better invest their time into the conspiracies with the secret societies, the conspiracies, real conspiracies, with the one world currency that's coming, the digital currency, with the social guidance and social control that's coming. There's a lot of things that people could put their time and attention into. People could put a lot of time and attention into focusing on the what's going on in the geopolitical realm with Gog and Magog situation. In other words, with Russia, Iran, and Persia. Iran and Turkey. So I think if we took less time off of this nature stuff and looking for a man-caused conspiracy here and put it into some of the stuff that's undoubtedly a conspiracy, it would be a great blessing to us. What about the technology they're using, like the Massive Hadron Collider? Well, the Massive Hadron Collider, its primary purpose is looking for certain particles that they believe to exist based on their particle theory. And there's actually scientists, legitimate bona fide scientists, who are skeptical of some, if not all, of the particle theory that they're investigating. So, you know, they're looking at smashing negative and positive subatomic particles against each other and maybe possibly causing a black hole. They're doing some interesting things. But what can this massive Hadron Collider do? Well, it doesn't really, I mean, maybe they're thinking they could come up with a technology where it would generate energy. I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that their plans are aiming at. There seems to be some indication of that. But the thing takes a massive amount of energy. But the amount of energy that we're putting in the Hadron Collider would not be anywhere near enough energy to create a hurricane. And then when it comes to diverting meteors, we have theories on how to divert meteors. We have theories we can do it with nuclear warheads. We have theories we can do it with lasers and break them up. We got some interesting theories, but this is all just theory. And some of the theories, it's just my opinion, but some of these theories sound like saying, I have a theory that when this train comes blasting down the track at 50 miles an hour, I can hit it with my slingshot. And if I hit it just the right spot, it'll stop the train. It will take a serious amount of energy to stop a comet. If the comet is 1 kilometer across, it will take a serious amount of energy to stop it. It would take a serious amount of energy to turn it away from hitting the Earth. And if you hit it with enough energy to turn it away from Earth, you would break it into thousands of pieces. And maybe none of those pieces would hit Earth, they'd all burn up, but maybe some large pieces would hit. And now the damage is spread rather than focus in one spot. Yeah, there's what do you think of a C-17 being loaded with supplies for North Carolina and the plane was never sent? Yeah, obviously there's some weird things going on with North Carolina and with some other locations, Tennessee and stuff. Let me just put it this way. I don't know whether this is a determined government FEMA problem where they are intentionally refusing to deal with the situation, or if this is just incompetence. I haven't investigated enough that I can make a clear judgment on what's going on here. But obviously, the bare minimum, we're seeing some severe incompetence. And, you know, I read a story about a gentleman who, or actually saw a video and read a story where he was using his private helicopter to help people and to ferry supplies and ferry people around. And the FEMA representative, well, actually, it wasn't directly a FEMA representative. It was like the local fire department assistant chief or fire department chief, I don't remember which, who shut his operation down, said the guy was in his way. Personally, if I was running an operation like that, anyone that came in to want to help, I would put him to work. Say, you go use that landing field over there. You ferry stuff out of there. And everyone else that came in to want to help, I put him to work. So some of this stuff is really mind-numbing that they don't want help. Doesn't it seem like God is allowing technology and our inventions to cave in on us for polluting and defiling the earth? That is an excellent point. There's no doubt about it. A lot of the technology that we're using gives us damage as part of the results of it. You know, a lot of our fertilizing technology is destroying the earth. A lot of our medical technology is creating more problems than it solves. Our energy sources that we've chosen, often, though we need to have energy sources, we don't do it the best way, and it creates damage to the environment. That's just the way we mine creates damages to the environment. we could mine with a lot less damage to the environment, and we need to mine. We need oil, but a lot of our technology is really dollar-based rather than blessing-based. Any thoughts on Bitcoin? Well, I have long believed that Bitcoin was a technology that was going to go into the future and somehow be used with the one world government technology. Maybe not necessarily Bitcoin itself, but the blockchain technology behind it. It's not a doubt in my mind that the government aims to eventually introduce its own digital currency using blockchain technology, and they will at that point ban all technology, Bitcoin technology other than theirs, require you to turn it in at a discount, and if you don't turn it at a discount within a certain amount of time, you will lose it. It's going to be very, very difficult. They're going to make it almost impossible to have any black market in the New World Order. All right. With this, we are done with the questions. Thank you very much, folks, for showing up, for listening. I know this was an odd live stream time. It was really the only time I could fit it in this weekend. I have meetings tonight, and tomorrow evening I'm traveling, and then I got stuff going on every evening here in the near future, but I do have material that I can maybe put up videos. So I appreciate your showing up. Thank you for the questions. Hopefully I've given you some good food for thought, help you to process this much more. Certainly, I don't think we should trust our government. That's a definite thing that we shouldn't be doing. I just personally don't believe that they have arrived at the technology yet to create and steer a hurricane. At any rate, I'm going to close with that thought. Thank you, moderators. Thank you, all my friends out there. Thank you for all the listeners. May God bless you and watch over you. Keep looking up, folks. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire, and we'll see you next time.